Out of the dangerous drought at Lake Mead. It provides 40 million Americans with water, and now it's at the lowest level since it was created in the 1930s.
I'm going to tell you something. This is showing us the biggest natural disaster that's going to happen to America.
There is a number that engineers in the American Southwest do not like to talk about: 895 feet. If the water level of Lake Mead ever drops to that point, water would no longer flow naturally through Hoover Dam. The turbines would stop spinning. Hydropower would shut down. And the water supply that supports more than 25 million people across the western United States could suddenly face a serious threat. Just a few years ago, the lake fell to its lowest level since it was first filled in the 1930s. Along the walls of Black Canyon, a massive white ring appeared, a mineral stain often called the bathtub ring. It stretches across miles of dark canyon rock, showing exactly how far the water has pulled away. From satellite images, that pale scar is visible from space, a reminder of how dramatically the reservoir has changed. Even after several winters with stronger snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the reality has not shifted much. The lake still sits roughly 140 feet below its designed level. And that raises a troubling question. Scientists have been asking for years, if the water keeps falling, what happens to the dam that has powered and supplied water to the American Southwest for nearly a century, if you drive from Las Vegas toward Hoover Dam? The first thing you notice is not the massive wall of concrete. It is the canyon itself. Along the steep black rock walls surrounding Lake Mead, a giant pale band stretches for miles. Locals call it the bathtub ring. It is not paint or stone. It is a thick layer of mineral stains left behind as the water slowly pulled away year after year. That white ring rises as high as a 10-story building in some places. From certain angles, it looks like a scar carved into the canyon. It marks the level where the water once stood when the reservoir was full. When Lake Mead is completely full, its surface sits at about 1,221 feet above sea level. At that level, the lake holds roughly 26 million acre-feet of water, enough to supply cities, farms, and power plants across the Southwest for years. But today, even after a couple of stronger snow seasons in the Rocky Mountains, the lake level still hovers around 1,070 to 1,080 feet. That means the reservoir remains about 140 feet below its intended level. In simple terms, a lake designed to store nearly 9 years of river flow now holds closer to 2. The white ring on the canyon walls is not just a visual mark, it is a reminder that the water system supporting millions of people is shrinking faster than most expected. At first glance, it might seem like the falling water levels at Lake Mead are simply the result of drought, but the deeper truth is more complicated. The problem did not begin in recent years. In fact, it began more than a century ago, with a single agreement that shaped how the river's water would be divided. In 1922, representatives from 7 western states met in Santa Fe, New Mexico to sign what became known as the Colorado River Compact. The goal was straightforward: divide the water of the Colorado River among the states that depended on it. The states included Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Using river flow records from the late 1800s and early 1900s, negotiators believed the river carried about 16.5 million acre-feet of water per year. Based on that assumption, they split the water between the upper basin states and the lower basin states, later promising an additional share to Mexico through an international treaty. On paper, the system looked balanced. But decades later, scientists studying ancient tree rings discovered something surprising. The early measurements used during negotiations came from an unusually wet period in the river's history. Long-term climate data shows that the Colorado River typically carries only 12 to 13 million acre-feet of water per year. In other words, the agreement promised far more water than the river could consistently provide. From the very beginning, the system was dividing a supply that did not truly exist. Even if the original water agreement had been perfectly balanced, the Colorado River Basin would still be facing another powerful challenge: a long and intensifying dry period across the American Southwest. Climate researchers studying the region have found that the current drought affecting the Colorado River Basin is not just another short dry cycle. Using tree ring records that stretch back more than 1,000 years, scientists have concluded that the region is experiencing one of the worst mega-droughts in at least 1,200 years. Unlike a typical drought that might last a few seasons, a mega-drought can persist for decades, slowly draining rivers, lakes, and underground water supplies. Much of the water that feeds Lake Mead begins as snow in the Rocky Mountains. During winter, snowpack builds across high elevations. In spring and summer, that snow melts and flows downstream into the Colorado River system. But warmer temperatures and shifting weather patterns have reduced the amount of snow that stays on the mountains. For more than 2 decades, the river system has been receiving less water than expected. At the same time, cities, farms, and industries across the Southwest have continued to depend on the same supply. The result is a growing gap between how much water nature provides and how much people take from the system each year. For decades, Hoover Dam has been more than just a massive wall holding back water. It is also one of the most important hydroelectric power plants in the western United States. Built during the Great Depression and completed in 1935, the structure rises 726 feet above the floor of Black Canyon, anchoring millions of tons of concrete into solid rock. The dam generates electricity using a principle known as hydraulic head. Simply put, the higher the water level in Lake Mead, the more pressure the falling water creates as it rushes through giant intake pipes toward turbines deep inside the dam. When the water drops hundreds of feet, it strikes those turbines with tremendous force, spinning massive generators that produce electricity. At full capacity, Hoover Dam can generate roughly 2,000 megawatts of power, enough to supply electricity to more than 1 million homes across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. But as Lake Mead has fallen over the past 2 decades, that pressure has weakened. Every lost foot of water reduces the force pushing through the turbines. By 2022, when the lake reached historic lows, power production at the dam had dropped dramatically by around 25 to 40%. To keep electricity flowing, engineers were forced to install special low-water turbines designed to operate with less pressure. It was an unusual solution for a facility that once stood as one of the most powerful hydroelectric systems in the country. For the city of Las Vegas, the falling water levels at Lake Mead are not just an environmental concern, they are a direct threat to the city's survival. Nearly 90% of Las Vegas's drinking water comes from this single reservoir, which sits just behind Hoover Dam. When the lake was first developed, engineers built intake pipes designed for a reservoir that would remain well above 1,000 feet in elevation. For decades, that assumption held true. But as water levels began to fall in the early 2000s, officials realized something alarming. If the lake continued dropping, the original intake structures could eventually begin pulling in air instead of water. That possibility pushed regional water managers to take an expensive and highly ambitious step. Under the leadership of Pat Mulroy, the Southern Nevada Water Authority launched a project known as the Third Straw. This massive engineering effort involved drilling a 3-mile tunnel deep beneath the lake bed, reaching an intake point nearly 860 feet above sea level, far lower than the previous water intakes. Completed in 2015 at a cost of about $1.4 billion, the Third Straw ensured that Las Vegas could continue drawing water even if Lake Mead fell to dangerously low levels. But the project did not solve the deeper problem. It simply allowed the city to keep drinking from the bottom of a reservoir that continues to shrink. While major cities have invested billions to secure their water supply, the first and hardest cuts have often fallen on rural farming communities. One of the clearest examples can be seen in Pinal County, a largely agricultural region located between Phoenix and Tucson. For decades, farmers in this area depended on water delivered through the Central Arizona Project, a massive canal system that carries water from the Colorado River across hundreds of miles of desert. That water supported fields of cotton, alfalfa, wheat, and other crops that helped sustain local economies and rural livelihoods. But when federal officials declared an official water shortage in 2022, farmers in Pinal County were among the first to feel the impact. Their water rights ranked lower in the system, meaning their supply would be reduced before cuts reached major cities. The consequences appeared almost immediately. Thousands of acres of farmland that had produced crops for generations were suddenly left dry. From the air, once green fields began turning into wide patches of cracked brown soil. For many farming families, the loss of water meant more than a bad harvest. It meant watching a way of life built over decades of work begin to disappear as the Colorado River system struggled to support every community that depended on it. The shrinking water supply of the Colorado River is not only a regional issue, its effects could ripple across the entire United States through something most people rarely connect to a desert river food. One of the most important agricultural regions in the country lies in the dry landscape of Imperial Valley just north of the Mexican border. Despite receiving very little rainfall each year, this valley has become one of America's most productive farming zones thanks to irrigation water delivered from the Colorado River. Nearly 700,000 acres of farmland depend on this system. Using carefully managed irrigation canals, farmers grow huge amounts of vegetables during the winter months when much of the rest of the country cannot. In fact, the region produces about 2/3 of the winter vegetables consumed in the United States. That means the lettuce in January, the broccoli in February, and the carrots appearing in grocery stores across the country often begin their journey in this desert valley. If water deliveries to the Imperial Valley were significantly reduced, the impact would extend far beyond California. Supermarkets, in cities thousands of miles away from the Midwest to the East Coast, could see rising prices and shrinking supplies, turning a regional water shortage into a national food concern. As the water of Lake Mead has slowly pulled away from its shoreline, the retreat has revealed more than just dry ground. It has begun exposing pieces of history that had been hidden beneath the surface for decades. In 2022, visitors near the lake's shoreline discovered a rusted metal barrel partially buried in the mud. Inside were human remains believed by investigators to date back to the 1970s or 1980s. As the water continued to drop, more remains were found in other areas around the reservoir, suggesting that the lake had quietly concealed evidence of past crimes for many years. But it was not only human stories that resurfaced. Near one part of the lake bed, a World War II-era Higgins landing craft emerged from the mud. Boats like this were famously used during the D-Day invasion in Europe and later served in survey work on the lake. Old dock posts, long sunken boats, and sections of the original canyon floor have also begun to appear. Each discovery carries the same message: the water has fallen lower than it has in generations. Behind the scenes, a major political challenge is approaching. The current rules that control how water from the Colorado River is shared are set to expire in 2026. When that deadline arrives, 7 U.S. states will need to renegotiate one of the most important water agreements in the country. The river system stretches across a large part of the American West, and the states involved include Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. For decades, they have relied on a complex framework that divides the river between upper basin states and lower basin states. The upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, argue that they have not yet fully used the share of water allocated to them under the original agreements. Meanwhile, the lower basin states, particularly California and Arizona, support some of the region's largest cities and farming regions, all of which depend heavily on water stored in Lake Mead. Every state recognizes that the river carries less water than expected, but deciding which regions should reduce their usage first remains a difficult political question, one that could shape the future of the entire Southwest. If you find this story about the Hoover Dam and the rising water level of Lake Mead interesting, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We cover major environmental changes, extreme weather, and little-known geographical stories so you don't miss any updates.